Hi, I'm Stefanos. I'm a PhD student at Imperial College London and also a security researcher at Ziki Security. And this is a joint work, as I said, with Sina, but also with Nico and Aki. So first of all, before we begin, why do we need rollups? So in blockchain, we say we have a trilemma between scalability, decentralization, and security. It's not a theorem, it's just like an intuition of different trade-offs that blockchain designers might pick. Some might argue that this has been solved by modern blockchains, etc. But public, truly decentralized blockchains like Ethereum and Bitcoin, they face a throughput limitation in terms of transactions per second they can achieve and they can process. So to scale, they use layer 2 solutions where basically users submit transactions to another completely different chain that eventually will post the transactions in the L1 that are going to be secured by L1's consensus protocol. And also you have nicer bridging rather than have a completely different chain. So how rollups and specifically ZK rollups work, basically we have our new chain that we will call here ZK Rollup, and it has a sequencer that users will submit transactions to that sequencer. Typically in the current setup, the sequencer is quite centralized, so a single entity runs the sequencer, which will eventually batch some transactions together in a single batch, and that can happen because some time spent or a number of transactions were added to the layer 2 blockchain, or some resource was completely used by the transactions included in that batch, and then it will execute the batch, and it will do two things. First, it will submit all the data for that batch in the L1, in the data availability of the L1. For example, in Ethereum, we will use blobs. And it will also send that batch to a prover to generate a proof that can then submit to the L1 to verify it. And when the proof gets verified, we can say we have achieved finality and the L2 transactions were secured. Okay, so here are two graphs from L2 bits. The first one is the total value secured by L2s. And actually, I took this screenshot a few days ago, and now the total value is around 45 billion USD. So we can say that it fluctuates between 30 and 60 billions of USD. But more importantly, the number of transactions per second processed by L2s is around 200, whereas for Ethereum it's 12. So we can see that clearly a large user base and a lot of funds have been moved to L2s, and basically they have been secured by L2s, and users interact just with L2s nowadays. So it will be really bad if we had a denial of service attack vector and also an economic vulnerability in those rollups. So in this work, I will going to present an attack that with just 1,000 USD, an attacker can completely perform a dose for 1 hour for a ZK rollup. And on top of that, with a naive TFM that some ZK rollups use, basically it will also have a damage of 12K in 1 hour. So we are going to discuss why the existing mechanism could not work, and also we will present some mitigations for this attack. Okay, so what are the main costs that a ZK rollup has to cover? We can split them between fixed costs, that is basically the settlement, and it's composed of the transaction that will submit the L2 transaction batch data in the L1, basically in a block, and the transaction that will execute and run the verification logic in the L1. And we also have marginal costs that are composed by the data availability we need per transaction, the proving cost we need per transaction, and the L2 sequencing and execution costs that basically cover the L2 computation resources, the bandwidth in the L2, the storage in the L2, etc. So here we have a table that demonstrates based on the batch size for simple, I think, ERC20 transactions in ZK Sync, how we can split the costs. And we can see that the majority of the costs, because DA was at that point free, and during various times in Ethereum, DA is free, it's mainly the commit and verification costs. Also proving can be significant for large batches, but for smaller batches, it's not that significant. So, what is a TFM in general, but also in the rollup context, and why it differs from L1s? So, in general, we use a TFM to very intuitively say how much a user should pay so their transaction will be included in some block in the future in the blockchain. For a ZK rollup, we don't have to just cover the normal gas cost we might have to cover in the L1, but we have to cover the transaction, basically gas cost. We also have to cover the proving cost, and we also have to cover L1 costs. And L1 costs are composed from DA and settlement cost, as we discussed previously. So let's move on and try to understand what is the issue. So for an L2 transaction, we have to pay, as I already said, the L2 fee for that transaction, and some L1, let's call it data fee for that transaction. So the L2 fee, we already discussed it, is just gas to cover basically execution in the L2, etc., and also the proving. And for the rest of the presentation, we can forget about proving and focus on the DA part. For the L1 data fee, what we have to pay is some part of the commitment cost, right? And also, we need to cover the cost for the amount of bytes our transaction will require to post it in the L1. So what we can see in that specific fee formula is that for L1 base fee, which is the commitment cost, we will multiply by a commit scalar. And that commit scalar, it's basically based on the targeted number of transactions we will have per batch. So each transaction in the batch should cover part of that cost. Then for the bytes, we basically multiplied it by a blob scalar, which is some factor to count for any compression that we are going to do, multiplied it by the bytes we will need in the L1 for this transaction, and multiplied by the L1 blob base fee. What is the cost currently to post some bytes as a blob, as in a blob in the L1? And we can also make that a bit more expensive to take into consideration price fluctuations that might happen from the time the L2 user will submit the transaction until the time the L2 operator will submit the batch to the L1. So a critical flaw here is that the first component also has a constant regardless of the transaction size and regardless of the batch size. And the economic consequence of that is that the fixed costs are more amortized across fewer transactions when batches are smaller. And the attack opportunity here is that basically when a transaction takes most of the batch space, then it should pay just a very small fixed cost. So how the vulnerability can work here is that we can create a very large transaction that does nothing and it just consumes potential DA space. And we can also increase the priority fee, and because most rollups basically order transactions based on priority fees, it will pick our transaction because it will have a higher priority fee. And as a result, the protocol will have to pay more rather than the fees it collected from transactions, and midnight transactions will get rejected. So we instantiated this attack for the scroll blockchain, where basically we just create transactions, as I already said, with minimal computation. We create some random call data bytes, so they cannot compressed very aggressively. And basically for those call data, we only need to have to pay 1.3 million gas for cover the whole space for a single blob in L2 gap. And we also use the minimum gas priority fee possible based on what was the gas priority fee at scroll. And this attack also works because the DA price won't decrease that aggressively in the L1, because in that particular case, we will only consume one blob. Because at that point, scroll has a limit that each batch should have only one blob. So what we achieve here is two things. First, we perform a denial of service because other L2 users won't manage to get transactions in, but also we have some economic damage. So we computed that in scroll, basically in 1 hour, we can create 1.2K batches. And that will cost the attacker almost 1K, a bit more. And the attacker basically will have to pay intrinsic gas, which is the amount of gas he has to pay per transaction it performs in the L2. It will pay in L2 gas fees for the call data it will submit in the L2 around $980. And for L1 data fee, that will cover both the blob cost and the commit, and should cover the commit cost, it will only pay $8.25. And as a result, we can see that per transaction, the protocol cost, because of the commitment cost at that point in the L1, was $11. Now it's much lower, but it's basically the proportion that is the important one. The user transaction will just have to pay to the L2 1.55, so around 10%. So per transaction, the loss is $10. So what the attacker achieves with that is that we have an economic damage, first of all, in the L2. We have a denial of service attack, and that denial of service attack can also be used for market manipulations. If, for example, there are cross-chain arbitrage opportunities, that there is going to be a presentation tomorrow about that, and basically the attacker can profit in millions from market disruption by doing something like that, but also it will be really bad for the Rollup and for Rollup's reputation. So the immediate mitigation we can achieve is we just can go and perform a formula readjustment, where basically we will take into consideration for the commitment cost the transaction size. And by that, basically, we will eliminate the economic damage from this attack. That will work, but we can apply some more things because we are in a completely centralized space in existing rollups. Basically, we can apply some monitoring and try to adapt fees if we observe the attack, or don't accept transactions that consume a lot of DA and not have much computation. But that kind of defenses couldn't work in a truly decentralized blockchain. So we have already discussed this attack with some major rollups, and they try to apply some fixes. But for the denial of service, the fixes are not that simple. So what we can do as a long-term solution that we know it's going to work. First of all, we can apply multidimensional tfms, where we price each resource differently. For example, we have a different market for DA, a different market for proving, and a different market for normal gas. What we need to do is definitely improve the metering for DA in the rollups, and that's because the rollups, although they get the DA from the L1, they have an upper bound of DA they can consume. So if users really want a lot of DA to be consumed in the L2, there should be a mechanism to price it. And also we want to have incentive realignment and analyze how we can ensure different partitioners in the rollups to operate and incentivized to optimize batch composition for all of them. So in our work, we also explore two additional attacks. One DA saturation attack that basically tries to attack the L2 finality. So batches get land in the L1, but with serious delays. The attack idea there, it's pretty similar to this one, but the goal is a bit different, and what the rollup is doing in its TFM, it's different too. And we also have been working on proof-if-side denial of service attacks, where basically we have a traditional resource exhaustion attack due to opcode mispricing in the L2s, and we are doing that in collaboration with Connor. So, what are the main takeaways? First of all, we demonstrated a novel denial of service attack and an economic sustainability attack against rollups. And we argue that there might be more, and more research needs to go towards that goal to have as good as possible TFMs for rollups. We highlight the importance of aligning economic incentives with costs in rollups and not go towards a path where we subsidize transactions to be competitive against other blockchains in the cost of potential attacks. And also we emphasize the need for multidimensional fee mechanism deployed in practice for rollups and especially for ZK rollups. So that was it. You can find a preliminary paper we did in archive, and we are going to release this work soon. And I also want to thank TLDR and the Uniswap Foundation for the support for this work. Thank you.
Thanks a lot, Stefanos. So we have a bunch of time for questions. I see somebody over there.
Hi, thank you for the talk. So you said that in ZK rollups, the cost or the fees are for the L2 execution, and then there's a part for the L1 that has to do with L1, and that you divide it into two parts, one of which is dependent on the transaction size and one that is constant, right?
Mm-hmm.
I guess the one that is depends on the transaction size has to do with the how much it costs to actually post the data on the L1. And so my question is, because I missed it, what exactly is the constant part? What is the cost there? What do you pay for?
Basically, you pay for the L1 transaction, right? The rollup operator needs to perform a transaction that will post the blob. That involves calling a smart contract that will do some operations in the L1, plus attaching the blob with that transaction for keeping it in the L1 DA.
Right, but why would the initial design decision be to charge something constant?
Okay. Because and if you look empirically in the data, you will see that there is an average, that there is not that many outliers, that around 1,000 transactions are submitted by bots. So the easy way to do it, and also maybe the better way for users, right? To be, okay, we have a very small constant fee for that, is to just have it like that. But that will lead to some economic damage in extreme situations.
Thank you.
Any other questions? I have a question. Does this also apply potentially to optimistic rollups or any kind of more generic kind of scaling solution in terms of the mispricing aspect of this?
Yeah, I would say as long as optimistic rollups have similar TFMs, and similar TFMs means they don't have a secondary market in the L2 for DA, then the same denial of service attack could apply. One parameter in the attack is what is your block production rate in the L2. So if the block production rate is too fast, then it means that you can create a lot of batches in the time period that the L1 create one block. So if you try to submit all the batches with all the blobs, probably it will instantiate the APE 1559 mechanism in the L1 to make DA more expensive. And that will basically make the attack more expensive for the attacker. Yeah, that's one part of it. And yeah, that's basically it.
Thank you. We do have time for a couple more questions if anybody has something. All right, let's thank the speaker.